Welcome to another episode of Exploring Boys Education, a regular podcast produced by the International Boys Schools Coalition, in which we explore the world of boys' education. I'm Bruce Collins. In this episode, we speak with Headmaster Ross Featherston and Dr. Ray Swan, both from Brighton Grammar School in Australia, about the important topic of masculinity. Ross and Ray share about how they have taken a research-based approach to operationalizing positive masculinity and share their experience in this regard by way of advice for boys' schools around the world. Before we dive into this important conversation, however, I'm joined again by my colleague Amy Ahart for the IBSC Newsreel. Thanks, Amy, for joining me.
Thank you, Bruce, and hello, listeners. We are excited to share that we have 3 online classes starting on July 12th. Responsible Sexual Citizenship in Today's World, the Challenges Facing Boys, Single Gender Education, a course for teachers new to boys' schools, and the Tech Solution, creating healthy habits for boys growing up in a digital world. Visit the IBSC website for more information and to register for these professional development opportunities. I'd also like to highlight that in April, the IBSC Task Force on Recognizing, Acknowledging, and Addressing Inequities in the Lives of Young Men of Color hosted the IBSC Virtual Global Forum on Racial Equity in Boys' Education. More than 75 boys from IBSC member schools worldwide engaged in frank conversations about identity, the role of education in a diverse world in which values are increasingly tested and contested, and next steps towards greater racial equity in boys' education. As a community, we celebrate the essential work of these thought leaders. We especially thank Task Force Chair Jack Pinnell and the entire task force for leading the charge and sharing more about this vital effort during the IBSC virtual conference. In the latest issue of The Compass, you can read more about the conference as experienced by students at St. Mark's School of Texas in the United States.
Such important work for sure, Amy, and I agree. It was wonderful to hear feedback from the task force recently. We also trust that boys' schools everywhere will continue to engage their students in these important conversations. Another important area of focus for boys' schools is masculinity, and I know many IBSC schools are wrestling with how best to approach this conversation. A number of our podcasts this season have highlighted this issue, and in this episode, we gain some insights into the practicalities of operationalizing positive masculinity in boys' schools. It's wonderful today to be joined from Brighton Grammar School in Melbourne by Headmaster Ross Featherston and Dr. Ray Swan, who heads up Brighton Grammar School's Crowther Centre. I'm talking to them today because I read a fascinating article of which amongst others, they were co-authors, called Operationalizing Positive Masculinity, a theoretical synthesis and school-based framework to engage boys and young men. And it really resonated with me. And so I'm grateful to both of you for joining me for this conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us, Bruce.
Pleasure to be here.
By way of introduction, before we focus on today's topic of positive masculinity in boys' schools, Ross, as head of Brighton Grammar School, I'd love for you to share a little bit about the school you lead.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for having us on. It's great to talk to our IBSC colleagues out there. So Brighton Grammar, we're an Anglican boys' school located in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. We're situated in a very nice part of Melbourne, Bayside, Melbourne. We're an Anglican school, as I mentioned. We're an ELC kindergarten through to year 12 school. So we've got about 1,450 boys from 3-year-old all the way through to 18-year-old. We're a traditional school in the sense that we were founded in 1882, so we're coming out to our 140th year soon. But I'm sure you'll ask Ray in a minute, but we're doing some contemporary things around educating our boys, not only from an academic perspective and doing all the things that our schools do, but from a sort of a heart and soul and character perspective. So that's us.
That really resonates with me. I love this idea of marrying tradition with cutting edge innovation in education. And I think that's probably where, Ray, you come in, because you lead the Crowther Centre, which I went onto the website of the Crowther Centre, and it's positioned as the engine that powers BGS. and I love the way that has been put. But maybe
you can share a little bit about your work and the purpose of that research centre.
Yeah, for sure. So, look, firstly, thanks for the opportunity to chat. It's pleasure to be here. The work that we do in the Crowther Centre, as you already pointed out, it is, I guess, the engine that powers the school, powers the thinking around the school. I guess, like a lot of educational institutions, we've been really fascinated by the progress in educational research, over the last sort of 10, 15 years in particular, and how we're seeing more of an interplay between educational psychology, social science research, scientific research, and so on, and what that might mean for us as a school. And probably about 5 or 6 years ago, we made a strategic decision that we wanted to really amplify the role of the Crowther Centre in the school. And that was to essentially improve the quality of the decisions and the decision making that we had. So we wanted everything to kind of run through this lens of research, if you like. But of course, as I'm sure you, Bruce, and the listeners would appreciate, sometimes it can feel like a massive anchor. It really slows things down, and it doesn't, create innovation. So we took it upon ourselves to look at what other industries have a really useful process around using evidence, if you like. And, we looked at medicine. I was fortunate as part of my postgraduate studies to do work in medical education. And as part of that, was introduced to a whole way of thinking around, an evidence model and using different domains within that model. And we've been able to apply that, I think, reasonably successfully at the school. And in more recent times, we've been sharing that work more broadly. So moving out of just, I guess, the work that we do at the school, but also consulting with other schools. We run a podcast called Understanding Boys. We have position papers available to the public more generally, and we're sort of making more commentary on I think the issue around masculinity, which I know was what we're here to talk about today, and partnering with other research institutions as well.
And I suppose as these conversations become more front of mind for boys' schools, particularly around something like masculinity, to have a research-based approach is really valuable and critical. And I'm looking forward to diving into some of your thinking around that later in this episode. But I want to start with maybe an obvious question, and maybe the answer is obvious, but I'd like to start there. If you think about the current debates around things like toxic masculinity, why is it important in your mind and in your experience as you've grappled with this work for boys' schools to encourage boys to embody healthy expressions and identities of masculinity?
I think, Bruce, I'll give the headmaster sort of big picture answer, I guess, and Ray can jump in with a bit more detail, perhaps. I think it goes to the heart of what a boys' school should be about. As I mentioned before, Brighton Grammar, like a lot of the listeners' schools, we do great things with, in our academic space. In our co-curricular space, we run fantastic music programs and drama programs and sport programs and all these wonderful things that boys really dive into and engage with. But I think if we're not addressing, some listeners will be familiar with a guy called Steve Biddulph, who's an Australian expert in some of this stuff. And I'm pinching a phrase of his, but I think we want to develop young boys, young men that have heart and backbone. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about is probably addressing the heart aspect. But I think in sending out young men into a world which is changing and evolving, and certainly a lot of the things that in that space are for the good and for better. The world is different to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago when I went through school. That it gets to the heart. It doesn't matter how many trophies you win as a school or how good your academic results are. If you're not producing, again, boys with that heart and backbone piece, I think, then I don't think we're doing our job. And issues around respect and understanding and diversity, all these sorts of things we think are really, really important to what our school does. And I think a lot of listeners would be of the same mind.
I guess what I'd jump in on there as well is just, Bruce, you're talking about, phrases like toxic masculinity, and so on. I guess in our thinking, and certainly what the research is showing pretty clearly is that, it's really about gender norms. So, the messages that we receive, whether they're biologically or culturally determined about our gender, And obviously, as boys' schools, what's our role to play in that? What people often say, well, life is co-educational. Why would you have single gender schools? And the reality is, yes, life is co-educational in some senses, but actually our most intimate and deeper sense of ourself is usually based on our gender and how we identify. When I look at you, I see a man. We have this sense of gender, whatever our construction of that is. And I think it's really important that we look at, well, how do you embody, healthy masculinities? What is a healthy masculinity? What does it mean? And again, what the research shows us is that across the course of life, if folks that don't have healthy senses of who they are and they don't have a healthy identity around their gender, they have, course of life outcomes that aren't great, and we know certainly in Australia that, of suicides, 75% of them are men. We know that, that men and boys in particular, they're more likely to act out with violence. They have a higher, substance abuse is higher amongst men, gambling and so on. Like these kinds of outcomes are actually very gender specific. And so, I think boys' schools have a real role to play, in understanding gender and educating around gender, particularly, around healthy masculinities. And that's really what a big part of our work in this paper, in positive masculinity, has been about.
So I feel like boys' schools are at a watershed moment, and maybe it's been over the last number of years, but particularly around these conversations about masculinity and expressions of masculinity. And I think, in my experience, one of the challenges boys' schools face is with regards to outdated expressions of masculinity. And, how are you maybe facing those challenges? What are the challenges that boys' schools have with regard to those outdated expressions? Because I think there's a tension there, isn't there?
There is, and again, from my perspective, from the sort of the headmaster's perspective, I guess we need to challenge those traditional notions. And our context is Australia, and I'm a history teacher, so the Australian identity and these sorts of things is something I'm very interested in. Have been interested in for a while, but in Australia, there's some particular notions of masculinity which I don't think are overly helpful. We don't want our boys to think that by asking for help is a sign of weakness, or by showing their emotions is a sign of weakness, or by gritting your teeth and soldiering on and going it alone. Some of these things aren't helpful. But on the flip side, there's quite a bit of subtlety and nuance to this. But on the flip side, we want our boys to be resilient. So there can be a bit of a tension there around, not all traditional notions of masculinity are bad, because some of them are quite good. Again, it comes back to that Biddulph thing about backbone. We want being tough and grit. Grit's a really great characteristic. We want people to because life throws up all sorts of challenges, doesn't it? But some of those traditional things, particularly in Australia, I know worldwide, that and I think we're moving in the right direction as a society in breaking down some of those notions. That crying is a sign of weakness, these sorts of things, and we try and have we have conversations with our boys at school about this, and we use role modeling and these sorts of things is really important. I don't necessarily go up and whenever I talk to the boys burst into tears every time, but I've cried in front, and I'm sure other senior staff at schools like ours would be the same. At the right time, you show your emotion, and we try and we talk about some of these more, I guess, more feminine aspects of the masculine. We talk about them with the boys at the right time and in the right way. So I think there's a number of things that we can do, but and I think boys' schools have an absolutely key role to play in this. Because as I said at the start of this podcast, to me anyway, it gets to the heart of what a good boys' school is about, and you can address it, head on, and as long as it's part of the schools, on the schools, in inverted commas, agenda, then I think boys' schools absolutely have a role to play in this, and boys' schools get a bad rap at times. I think when all of this stuff's done really well in a boys' school, it can be done really, really well. But as we know, when it's not done well, that's when some real trouble can emerge.
Ray, you mentioned earlier this concept of healthy or positive masculinity, and before I read your article, I had this probably naive perception that it was easy to define what positive masculinity means, and yet when I read, what came out in the piece that you both were part of authoring, I realized it's not as easy as one might think, and so how might those of us in boys' education gain clarity on the definition of positive masculinity, particularly since there are many perspectives that shape what that term might mean to different people.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's what you just hit on there is exactly the challenge. It was a very difficult piece to work on, and there were, literally hundreds of hours, went into that, and the people that we work with at Origin, the Centre for Youth Mental Health, and the researchers there, played a key role, and we had a design thinking process and all sorts of things around that. I think probably the simplest way to understand it is firstly, if you go to someone like Dr. Matt Engler-Carlson, who's based at the Centre for Men and Boys at Fullerton, and he probably around 15 years ago took a strength-based approach to counselling. And so he took things that were identified as kind of male traits, and then he looked at those and, well, how do we see that as in a strength-based way, not in a maladaptive way, so to speak. So something like stoicism, when is that a good thing? How do we use that as a way to sort of unpack, what's going on? So I think in its broader sense, it's about taking a strength-based approach to how we enact our own sense of gender, if that makes sense. But then there's really a couple of parts to it. There's knowing. So how do we know stuff? Like, how do we know about good ways to be? And in that, I think, our boys' schools are full of rich stories, and myths and history and dramas, all about, great ways to be as a human being. And so there's the knowing piece, and then there's the being piece. And within that, how do we be? And when we talk about the being, there's really three key elements to being, and Ross has probably touched on one of them already, which is a really important one, and that is that we are connected. And so when we talk about being connected, it's about relationships. It's about, being connected to our feelings and our experience of ourselves. So that's the first thing, is connected. The second is about being authentic, and authenticity, relates to, really our being comfortable in our own skin. And we talk about things about values. And again, a lot of this stuff, a lot of the schools are doing, but in terms of, I guess, making it more intentional and a bit more visible has been a really important part of our journey, at least. And the third area is just about being motivated. This idea, it's a key driver in who we are. And I think, again, when we think about the stories that we all know and love and that we often share with our boys, this, actually being motivated in terms of being self-determined, going out to do good things and do good works, is also a really important part of, having an embodied masculinity that is positive.
So, Ross, I'm fascinated to hear how this framework that Ray has outlined for us here, that came from this research that you've all been doing. I'm fascinated to see how that lands in practice in a school context. How are you at BGS applying this framework so that boys encounter this concept of positive masculinity in a way that sits? I think, in boys' education, we want things to sit with boys and to stay with them as they leave our doors. How's that happening in your school?
Yeah. The way I'd sort of divide this up a little bit is the implicit and the explicit. And in some ways, both are very important. And in some ways, the implicit can be more powerful than the explicit. So the implicit things for me include the cultural things, the role modeling things. I think what Ray said before about being very deliberate or overt with an approach to this is really important. As leaders in a school, boys, we know that boys are receptive to role modeling. As leaders in a school, we want to make sure that we are role modeling these behaviours, these values that we're talking about. So it's not old school yelling and these sorts of things. At times you might need to raise your voice to a boy, but it's about how you talk to an individual boy or how you talk to students in a smaller group. It's about how you interact with other members in the community, that boys will see you do that. It's about being present. I think, as I mentioned before, it's about not being afraid to show your emotions as a leader. Ray spoke about authenticity, being an authentic person in front of the boys as well. I'm very mindful of, I'm a fan of the drip on a rock theory, that over time the drip will make a dent in the rock. And the more you talk about these sorts of things with the boys across all year levels in the school, obviously age and stage appropriate, I think over time things will start to shift in the right direction. I'm very mindful as a leader of the school, what I say to the boys at things like our chapel services and assemblies when you're talking to kids en masse. I mentioned before the more feminine aspects of the masculine. I often will talk about things like kindness. Kindness is it's not a theme we've landed on this year, but we are talking a lot about kindness as a school. This year, a number of years ago, I used a tragedy where a loss of life occurred in a school, not our school, fortunately, but a school up the road a number of years ago, and I used love as the theme. Challenging the boys to think about, well, what role does love play in an all boys school? So I think that you've got, like anything, you've got to be very deliberate and you've got to have it front of mind. So for me, the implicit, the cultural things are really, really important, because boys, as we know, boys are receptive. They will learn things by observing and by watching, as well as obviously being instructed. That's the implicit stuff. Maybe Ray can talk to the explicit stuff, which complements and underpins and sits very nicely with the implicit stuff. And again, it comes back to, at a high level, it comes back to being very deliberate and conscious of these sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're also referring to there, Ross, is the kids experience things in an environment, in a context. So you need to be thinking about, well, when you come into a school, what are you looking at? What are your rituals and processes? Like we do a lot of work in dialogic circles. So you get in the pastoral program, which a lot of schools would use. Sitting in circles and sharing. As a process to enable, that enables authenticity. As simple as that. When we involve our parents, we have a parent program, which again, we instruct around how to create a positive environment. What does that look like? How does that feel? What are things can you be doing at home, so that the kids are experiencing that. And Ross is referring to what are the stories that I'm hearing, and we all know so well how the impact or the power of a good story in a young boy's life. Just hearing something and knowing, well, that's I've got these choices that I can make, and this is the the two wolves, and this is the one I want to feed. This is the one that I really want to grow into something powerful. But sometimes society's changed, and some of the things that maybe we thought, and this perhaps speaks to some of the more traditional aspects of what we do. But I think some of us are always amazed by people don't have dinner as much together anymore as a family, or you're not getting that same value set. So where do you experience it? And again, with our kids, we have a curriculum that really explores, what is value? Like, what does it mean? What are your values, actually? And we actually, in classes, we made the decision a few years ago, all our health and PE teachers, so, the external, PE, ball game stuff, we trained all those folks in the health piece, so in the positive masculinity as well. So the same person that's teaching you about the rules of the game in a sporting game is teaching about the rules of the game in life. So when you look at a function of rules and what's your relationship to rules and the umpire and all that sort of stuff that we understand in, if you want to play football, where you got to, you play rugby, you got to, the ref, that's who calls it. And then in life, who's the ref? And what's happened with our, our sense and our connection to those things. So Ross was saying the explicit is also really important, and sometimes it's actually about the right medicine. And I guess the final thing I'd say around it is that it's not like everybody always loves doing this sort of stuff. It's not necessarily the coolest or the greatest or whatever, but it's meaningful. And it's also what our kids need. You know, they really do need some of this stuff because they're certainly not getting it from, the public media or movies that they're seeing and those sorts of things. They may, hopefully, and a lot are getting it from home life, but not always. And so they get it from school. And, what a great thing it is to come from a good place, to give someone that gift. I went to Brighton Grammar. That's where I went. I can always come back there.
The thing I'd sort of underline, I didn't mention it, but Ray mentioned it, is the involvement of the community and particularly parents. A lot of the things we're talking about here are values driven, or about values sort of underpin all this sort of stuff. And schools play a really key role in forming those sorts of things in our boys, but we can't forget the role the parents and the family and the broader community play in that as well. And Ray's mentioned a few of the things, and to come back to, I guess, to some of that explicit things, we're very mindful of engaging parents in this, and we run a whole bunch of parent programs and parent support and parent position papers and all these sorts of things that come out of that Crowther Centre thing we spoke about at the start. But that's a key. I mean, we talk here about the three-cornered partnership: the school, the boy, and the parent. That's a really key part of, you can't do this stuff two corners of two sides of the triangle. What's my metaphor here? I said I'm a history teacher, not a maths teacher. Two of the sides can't work. It can't be the school and the parent, or it can't be the school and the boy. All three have to be working together in order to affect the change that we want to come through.
There are a number of things that really stand out for me as we talk about this, because I think, depending on your context, this conversation in an all-boys school about masculinity can be very daunting. And I think some people may step away from the conversation because it is daunting. But what I love about what I've heard from both of you about your approach is that, there's an intentionality and a depth of thoughts about this. Before diving into work, there's been real intentional thoughts about it. And also, as you said, Ross, you used the drip on the rock analogy, where, this isn't a quick fix, is it? It's really a journey with boys. And then the other thing that I think is really crucial, that what I've heard, is this connection with parents, because I suppose you don't want your messaging at school to be at odds with where parents are at. You want everyone sitting around the same table and understanding what it means to raise good men in your context, or in any other boys' school.
Yeah, I completely agree. And a point of context I think that's important is this is my 8th year as headmaster, and Ray's been with me that whole time. And the position we're in now hasn't happened overnight, because you need to, and I'm sure that people listening to this podcast will be aware, you need to make sure that to use another metaphor, I guess, the grounds are fertile to sow some of these seeds. And you can't just jump in with some of it, because it'll fall on deaf ears. Again, to use another metaphor, I'm mixing things up here a little bit, but these things take time, and like any significant program or project schools like ours undertake, they take time to build and to do it properly. But yeah, it's the right thing to do. And again, you hit the nail on the head. It's a parent thing as well, the community aspect.
So I'm wondering, you both have shared some incredible advice as we've spoken through this topic, but I'm wondering if there's one last sort of nugget for those who are wanting to intentionally engage their students in work focused on positive masculinity that has come out of your research and your experience doing this work over the last 8 years.
Yeah, probably a couple of things from me, in no particular order. I think the boys want this. I think I try and not sit on my desk too much, so I try and get out into the playground and into the ovals and the grounds where the boys are, and have these little smaller, incidental, but again deliberate conversations. And I think the boys want they're reaching out for this. They need help. They need guidance. They need understanding. They need that development. So any listener that thinks, I wouldn't shy away from it at all. I think, as I said at the start, I think it's incumbent on boys' schools to do this sort of thing. But I think the boys are really receptive to it. The second thing I'd say, is is partnerships, and Ray might talk to this a little bit further. But we're very fortunate to have formed some fantastic partnerships again through our Crowther Centre, and we're looking for, this is not an advertorial, but we're looking for other schools around the world that are interested in our work and want to join up with us and do some of these sorts of things together. Because pre-COVID, when we were traveling to conferences and going to America and Europe and all these great places for the IBSC work, you completely different context, but we're all sharing the same things and the same challenges and the same issues. I think good schools, we're all got good schools. I think we share our practice, and we share some of these things that we do because it's for the betterment of the world in which we live. So, if anyone's listening to this podcast and wants to reach out, absolutely reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
I guess for me, we talked about what we do as teachers. We talked about the parents. Probably haven't spoken enough about students and the voice, I think, and their voices. And we've been doing it for 8 years, and we've made a few blunders along the way. But something that I think that we did get right was we worked with a guy called James Kerr, who some of the listeners might know, wrote a book called Legacy, and his work in Legacy with, I think we're the only school that he's worked with in terms of using that framework in a school, and that was an immediate change around positive values, enacted in a school environment. It was quite a huge change, and really what a lot of it came down to was the student voice. And as Ross was saying, the kids, they want it. They want to know that the good guys win. To use a story example, that's really what it comes down to. Being a good person, having good values, standing in a good faith will actually set you on the right course for your life. And that's a great thing to know, and to have that affirmed that you come from a good place, as I said earlier.
I'm aware of the fact that we could probably talk about this for ages, because there's so much to go into and so much to dive into. And I know so many of our schools are invested in and are doing this work already. But it's just been wonderful to hear your perspective and your understanding of this and the thoughts that you've put into this and the practicalities of how this work lands in a boys' school space. So I want to thank both of you for your time, for joining us. I'll certainly make your contact details available, Ross, so that people can reach out to you if they want to partner on some of this work. And I'm sure you're going to be getting lots of questions. So thank you so much, both of you, for your insights and your perspective.
Thank you, Bruce, for your time. And we're more than happy to share. As Ray said, we're not doing it perfectly well, and we make some blues along the way, but more absolutely love to hear from anyone. But thanks for your time, Bruce.
Thank you.
As we consider and think about what Ross and Ray have shared in this episode, I'd like to point listeners to Brighton Grammar School's Crowther Centre, where you can access resources related to this conversation. Head to crowthercentre.org.au to access these and to contact Dr. Ray Swan. Ray also hosts a great podcast called the Understanding Boys Podcast, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. Lastly, thank you again for your support of Exploring Boys Education and our other programs at IBSC. Until our next episode, keep safe and keep well.